My new boss fired me to cut costs, convinced my department was dead weight. He didn't realize my personal signature was the only thing legally insuring $73 million in federal contracts. So I signed the papers, handed over my badge, walked out of the building, and let the clock start ticking. That was the moment the story truly began. The migraine had started behind my left eye around 4 in the morning, right as I finalized the compliance appendices for the Whitmore project. It pulsed with the familiar rhythm of exhaustion I'd learned to ignore after years of 14-hour days. For the last 3 months, I had been single-handedly holding Summit Financial Solutions together, keeping them compliant, insured, and invisible to federal regulators who could shut the whole firm down with a single audit letter. By 10 a.m., the pain had dulled into a constant roar, but I was still at my desk, coffee cooling beside my keyboard, ready to fight the next fire. That's when the calendar invite appeared. 10 minutes. Mandatory, structural realignment. The glass-walled conference room they called the Summit always felt ironic to me. It was all clean lines and motivational posters, as if success could be manufactured with the right font choice. I sat there alone, staring at my reflection in the glass when the smell hit first. Expensive cologne. Sharp. Aggressive. Spencer Sterling arrived 5 seconds later carrying it like a warning signal. 32 years old, perfectly tailored suit, and the kind of confidence that only comes from growing up knowing failure would never truly touch you. His father owned most of the company. Spencer just wore it. He didn't sit. He paced, folder tucked under his arm like a prop. He smiled the way people do when they've practiced it in mirrors. He told me they were pivoting, streamlining, becoming leaner and more agile. He explained with rehearsed sympathy that my department showed redundancy. 13 years of regulatory defense erased by a spreadsheet and a buzzword. He slid the separation packet across the table as if it were a receipt. Immediate termination, credential removal, standard severance. Legal had reviewed everything. He said that part proudly. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not anger, not panic, just a heavy certainty. They didn't know what they had just done. I read the clause carefully, the one stating I was voluntarily surrendering my professional liability designation. The designation that existed because, over a decade earlier, I had passed federal certification exams before the regulatory overhaul changed everything. Back when only a handful of people in the region qualified. Back when the government still required a human signature instead of automated approvals. I had missed family events, anniversaries, entire years of my life earning that status. And now a man who thought compliance was checking boxes expected me to walk away quietly. So I signed. Every page, every initial, calm, polite. I even thanked him. Spencer looked relieved, almost disappointed I hadn't argued. He handed me a blue envelope afterward. Inside was a branded stress ball shaped like a dollar sign and a QR code for a mindfulness podcast. I left it on the conference table. The walk back to my office felt unreal. Coworkers peeked over cubicle walls, confused, curious, scared. They knew something was wrong even if they didn't understand why. I packed slowly. From the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, I retrieved the black leather binder. Old, worn, priceless. Inside were copies of underwriting approvals, federal correspondence, credential confirmations, and policy language no one else had bothered to read in years. The rules don't stop applying just because someone gets fired. Federal mandates don't care about corporate restructuring. They had fired the only person legally allowed to insure their biggest contracts. By the time I left the building, my old chair already belonged to someone else. Penelope Cross, 26, loud, recently hired, related to someone important. Her previous experience involved social media marketing for a failed juice startup. Now she was overseeing high-risk federal compliance worth tens of millions of dollars. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't warn anyone. Warnings had been ignored before. That night at home, I opened my laptop and logged into the National Risk Registry. The site looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s, but it didn't make mistakes. My credentials were still active, still tied to every policy Summit relied on. I selected surrender credentials due to separation from sponsoring organization. Checked the box. Confirmed. Submitted. At 11:58 p.m. the screen changed. Credential surrender confirmed. Notice sent to associated insurers. Coverage may be affected. By morning the panic began. Vincent from finance found the notice first. Policy hold. Coverage voided pending clarification of risk authority. Effective 12:03 a.m. he called legal. Legal called operations. Operations called Spencer. No replacement credential existed. No grandfathered authority. No workaround. Every federal contract was now uninsured. Every hour without coverage was a violation. Every violation carried penalties measured in millions. By noon, government auditors were calling. By afternoon, clients were pulling out. By evening, Spencer Sterling was learning what the phrase load-bearing employee really meant. They didn't fire me to save money. They fired me because they didn't understand value. And by the time they did, it was far too late. By the second morning, the building no longer felt like an office. It felt like a crime scene where no one was sure what law had been broken, only that something irreversible had happened. Spencer arrived early for once, jacket off, tie loosened, hair no longer perfectly in place. His assistant followed him down the hallway, whispering updates that made his jaw tighten with every step. 3 federal clients had suspended activity. 2 insurers had frozen coverage pending verification. 1 agency had requested an emergency compliance call before noon. Spencer shut himself into his glass office and stayed there, pacing like a trapped animal, dialing numbers that suddenly went straight to voicemail. Vincent's spreadsheets turned red fast. Not figuratively, literally. Automated flags lit up his screen as the system recalculated exposure with no active risk authority on file. $73 million in contracts were now operating outside federal compliance. That wasn't just risky, that was illegal. Bennett from legal finally said the word everyone had been avoiding. If this lasts more than 72 hours, we're looking at mandatory disclosure. Disclosure meant audits. Audits meant subpoenas. Subpoenas meant names. And once regulators started asking who approved what and when, the story would end up somewhere Spencer couldn't spin it with a slide deck. By mid-morning, my phone rang for the first time since I'd left. I didn't answer. It rang again and again. Then the emails started, polite at first. Preston, hope you're well, then confused. We're seeing some inconsistencies with the registry. By noon, the tone changed. This is urgent. By 1 o'clock, the subject lines dropped all pretense. Call me immediately. I watched them stack up from the quiet comfort of my kitchen table, Kaiser asleep at my feet, coffee still hot. For 13 years, I'd responded to every crisis within minutes. Now I let them wait. Spencer finally left me a voicemail just after 2. His voice had lost its practiced smoothness. There was an edge there now. Panic, buried under entitlement. He talked fast, stumbling over corporate language, insisting there must have been a misunderstanding. He said legal was reviewing options. He said my credential removal could perhaps be temporarily reversed. He never apologized. He never admitted fault. He ended the message with, "We need you back in the building today." Not asked. Needed. I deleted the voicemail without responding. What Spencer still didn't understand was that there was no undo button. Federal credentials aren't like email access or key cards. Once surrendered, reinstatement requires a formal review, sponsorship, and board verification. Weeks at best, months more likely. And even if they could fast-track it, the damage was already documented. The insurers had logged the lapse. The government had time-stamped it. Summit Financial's pristine compliance record now had a crack running straight through its foundation. At 3:30, a black SUV pulled into my apartment parking lot. Then another. Bennett stepped out first, jacket wrinkled, eyes hollow. Vincent followed, clutching a folder so tightly his knuckles were white. Spencer came last. He hesitated before approaching my door like he wasn't sure he was allowed to knock. That alone almost made me laugh. I let them stand there for a full minute before opening it. The conversation was short. They offered reinstatement, a title change, a salary increase, stock options, a performance bonus. Spencer even tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, as if the law had somehow misinterpreted his intentions. I listened politely. Then I told them the truth, that I was no longer affiliated with the company, that my credentials were surrendered legally and correctly. That reinstatement wasn't possible on their timeline, and that even if it were, I wouldn't do it. Vincent looked like he might be sick. Bennett closed his eyes. Spencer's face hardened, the entitlement giving way to something uglier. He reminded me of my non-compete. I reminded him of the clause stating it was void if the company initiated termination without cause. He reminded me of loyalty. I reminded him of the day he called my department redundant. They left with nothing. 2 days later, the federal notice became public. Temporary suspension of Summit Financial Solutions. R17 contracts pending compliance review. Investors panicked. Clients fled. Spencer's father called an emergency board meeting that night. By the end of the week, Spencer Sterling was no longer executive vice president of operations. Officially, it was a strategic leadership change. Unofficially, it was the cost of arrogance measured in millions. I never went back to that building. I didn't need to. My phone kept ringing anyway. Competitors, consultants, firms that had read the notice and understood exactly what it meant. There are very few people who know how fragile big systems really are. Fewer still who understand that sometimes the most powerful move isn't retaliation, it's compliance. And that's how I walked away quietly, while the company that fired me learned in real time that you can't cut costs by cutting the one signature holding everything together. The fallout didn't end with Spencer's removal. That was just the first visible crack in a structure that had been rotting quietly for years. Once regulators opened the door, they didn't stop at the threshold. They never do. The compliance lapse triggered a full scope audit, not just of the R17 contracts, but of every federal-facing operation Summit had touched in the last 5 years. Emails were archived. Calls were logged. Decisions that had once been waved through on business judgment were now examined line by line under fluorescent lights by people who didn't care who anyone's father was. Inside the company, fear replaced ambition almost overnight. Middle managers started documenting everything, forwarding emails to personal accounts, quietly polishing resumes. Penelope was removed from oversight within 48 hours, reassigned to an internal communications role that consisted mostly of silence. Vincent stopped sleeping. Bennett aged a decade in a week. Every conversation became a legal conversation. Every meeting ended with someone asking, "Is this discoverable?" That question alone told me how bad things really were. I heard most of it secondhand. Former colleagues reached out cautiously at first, then with increasing urgency. They wanted to know how this could have happened. They wanted to know if there was a way back. I answered honestly. This wasn't sabotage. It wasn't revenge in the way movies portray it. It was consequence. Systems built on shortcuts eventually collapse when the one person who understood the full architecture is pushed out by someone who never bothered to learn it. 2 weeks later, Summit's largest private client formally terminated their contract, citing reputational risk. That loss alone eclipsed my entire annual salary 10 times over. The board issued a carefully worded statement about temporary disruption. The market didn't buy it. Share value dipped, then slid, then fell hard. Spencer's father resigned shortly after, officially to focus on personal matters. No one said his name anymore without lowering their voice. As for me, life got quieter in the best possible way. I started sleeping through the night for the first time in years. The migraine behind my left eye disappeared completely. I took Kaiser on long morning walks instead of watching sunrise through office glass. When I finally accepted a consulting role months later, it was on my terms. Independent. Protected. No single point of failure tied to someone else's ego. Occasionally, I'd drive past the old building. The lights were still on, but fewer floors were occupied now. The Summit conference room had been renamed. New poster, new slogan, same glass walls. I wondered who sat there these days, rehearsing speeches about efficiency and innovation, unaware of how fragile those words really are. People like to think revenge is loud, explosive, public. But the most devastating outcomes are often silent, procedural, and completely legal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply stopped holding the weight they never knew I carried. And when the structure collapsed, all I did was step aside and let gravity finish the job. Years later, people would still argue about when Summit truly failed. Some said it was the day the suspension notice went public. Others pointed to the moment the board forced Spencer out. But those of us who understood how institutions really break knew the truth. Summit failed the instant they decided experience was an expense instead of an asset. The rest was just paperwork catching up. I received an invitation once, oddly enough. A compliance symposium in D.C., the kind filled with windowless rooms and bad coffee, where people who understood risk spoke quietly to one another while everyone else pretended to listen. Summit's name appeared on the attendee list with a small asterisk beside it. Conditional approval pending review. That asterisk said everything. They were still alive, technically, but no longer trusted. In our world, trust is currency. Once it's devalued, recovery is slow and rarely complete. During one panel, a younger analyst asked how companies could protect themselves from single points of failure. The irony wasn't lost on me. I answered carefully. I said redundancy isn't about replacing people. It's about respecting institutional knowledge and documenting reality instead of assumptions. I didn't name Summit. I didn't need to. A few heads nodded. A few people avoided my eyes. Word travels fast in small professional circles. Every so often I'd get a message from someone still inside the company. Short, guarded. You were right. Or, they still don't understand what you did. The last one made me smile. Understanding wasn't required anymore. The system had already passed judgment. The strangest part was how little satisfaction I felt about it all. There was no triumphal moment, no scene where I stood victorious while someone else crumbled. What I felt instead was relief. Relief that I no longer had to absorb the consequences of decisions made by people who mistook confidence for competence. Relief that my name, once buried in footnotes and appendices, now stood on its own. On a quiet afternoon, I finally threw away the blue stress ball Spencer had given me. The dollar sign had faded. The rubber cracked when I squeezed it. I dropped it into the trash without ceremony. Some symbols don't deserve to be kept. If there was a lesson in everything that happened, it wasn't about revenge. It was about leverage. Real leverage isn't loud. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't need witnesses. It lives in contracts, in clauses no one reads, in certifications earned the hard way and dismissed too easily. It lives in knowing when to walk away and when to stop protecting people from their own ignorance. They fired me thinking they were trimming fat. What they actually cut was the last thread holding everything together. And once it snapped, there was nothing left to do but let the silence speak for itself. The silence lingered long after Summit stopped making headlines. That was the part most people never see. The long tail of consequences that stretches quietly into years. No dramatic court verdicts, no public apologies, just a slow narrowing of options, fewer bids invited, more oversight imposed, extra clauses added just in case. Every new contract came with questions that hadn't been there before. Every answer had to be documented, double-checked, and signed by someone who now understood what it meant to carry personal responsibility. I moved on fully after that. New work, new clients, all of them cautious in a way Summit never had been. They asked better questions. They listened longer. When I said, "This is a risk," they didn't counter with buzzwords. They asked how to mitigate it. That alone told me I'd landed where I belonged. Once, at a private dinner after a regulatory roundtable, someone mentioned Summit casually, the way you mention an old scandal everyone remembers but no one needs explained. They were doing great until they lost their risk authority, someone said. Another replied, yeah, one bad decision. I didn't correct them. It wasn't one decision. It was a pattern that finally met a rule it couldn't bend. Late one night, months later, I opened the black leather binder again, not out of necessity, out of closure. The pages were yellowing at the edges now, relics of a time when I believed loyalty could compensate for being unheard. I closed it, slid it back into the drawer, and locked it away for good. Some leverage is meant to be used once, then retired. Sometimes I think about Spencer, about whether he ever truly understood what happened or if he still tells himself a simpler story, one where bad luck and rigid bureaucracy ruined his vision. People like him rarely change. They just move on to environments where the consequences take longer to arrive. But systems remember. They remember signatures. They remember timestamps. They remember who was authorized and who was not. And every so often, when a client thanks me for catching something before it becomes a problem, I think back to that morning, the migraine, the cold coffee, the calendar invite labeled quick sync. I think about how close I came to arguing, to explaining, to saving them one last time. I'm glad I didn't. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do, professionally, legally, even ethically, is step aside and let reality teach the lesson you no longer need to repeat. That was the real ending. Not a confrontation, not an apology, just a quiet understanding that some mistakes are too fundamental to be undone, and some exits are exactly on time. In the end, there was no victory speech and no public reckoning. Summit didn't collapse overnight, and Spencer didn't issue a tearful apology. What happened was quieter and far more permanent. The company learned, slowly, painfully, that authority isn't a title you assign in a meeting and risk isn't something you can delete from a spreadsheet. It lives in people, in signatures, in experience earned the hard way. I never went back. I didn't need to. The clock I'd started ticking finished its work without me standing there to watch. Federal systems updated, insurers adjusted, and contracts followed the rules exactly as written. No revenge was required. Compliance did the job for me. That's the part they never teach in business school. Sometimes the most devastating consequence isn't caused by anger or ego, but by someone calmly stepping away and letting the structure collapse under its own false assumptions. I wasn't fired for being wrong. I was fired for being inconvenient. And when I walked out of that building for the last time, badge surrendered and signature withdrawn, I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. I simply took the one thing they could never replace and left them to discover, far too late, what it had really been worth.